Santa Barbara was the site of the third largest oil spill in American history. Back in 1969, a blowout at an offshore oil rig sent 4.2 million gallons into the water.
State of emergency in California's Santa Barbara County this morning. 20,000 gallons may have reached the ocean after a pipeline ruptured Tuesday.
It's a full beach closure due to potential health risks from oil and tar here at Summerlin Beach at Lookout Park.
We've all heard oil is not good for the environment, but can you tell us why? You know, for those who don't work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, why is oil bad for the environment? Why is it bad for the wildlife? In an effort to understand the extent of the oil damage along the Santa Barbara coast, my environmental studies class and I went down to Summerlin Beach to see with our own eyes the impact the oil has had on the local beaches. You smell that? Delicious smell of oil.
Summerlin Beach is the first place in the world where offshore oil drilling was done.
Why Summerlin? Because the second largest natural oil seeps in the world are located on the Santa Barbara County coastline.
And at one point, over 400 wells had been drilled. This was 100 and 100 plus years ago. And so the technology then was pretty primitive, and the commitment to clean up afterwards was even more primitive. And in many cases, the companies just packed up and moved away and maybe shoved some rocks and rags and some concrete down the wells before they left.
Leakages from these improperly abandoned wells, as well as the oil released in accidental oil spills, certainly contribute to the amount found in the ocean and in the environment. But they are not the sole reasons for its presence, despite many people believing so.
The wells are supposed to be properly capped so there's no leakage, but what we've discovered is that a lot of these wells were abandoned by companies that are now out of business.
So why should the oil rigs be capped? Should they be capped?
It's a health risk, and of course it spoils one of our most beautiful beaches on the Central Coast.
What's the health aspect? I mean, we always say, okay, the oil is bad for animals, it's bad for birds, it's bad for... Mm-hmm. Of course it is. You know, there's the cute little Dawn commercials where they're cleaning the duck. But that's after oil spills. I don't know how extensive this seepage is. Natural
oil seeps in Santa Barbara can release up to 6,500 to 7,000 gallons of oil per day.
In general, we see much greater impacts on wildlife from spilled oil than we do from the natural seep oil. That's not to say that there's absolutely no effect from natural seepage. There is, but that's been occurring for a very long time, and the local ecosystem and animals are somewhat adapted to that and conditioned to deal with it. For whatever reason, and there's multiple reasons, in the event of a human-caused spill, we often see a much different impact on wildlife, much more severe.
That's like a can of worms, bringing up the issue like, well, why should the taxpayers have to clean up the mess of, you know, an industry from 100 years ago?
Well, it's a little bit unfortunate that these things are not cheap. So the estimate originally was about $700,000 to $800,000, but under the new plan, it's going to cost about $1.4 million to properly re-abandon the Becker wellhead.
The single wellhead.
Wellhead. California is actually pretty light on oil producers. We do not have an oil severance tax like almost every other offshore producing state.
And what exactly does that mean?
That would be a tax on their oil production that they would pay to the state.
Got it.
It's an idea whose time has long since come, and that money could then be used to address this old oil infrastructure, as it's called, that is primarily in Santa Barbara County. About 80% of the state's old oil infrastructure is here or up at Elwood and Goleta.
You know what, I've got friends that are avid oilmen, have been for a long time, and their stance that it is natural oil seepage makes sense to me. So while I would love to see them capped if they are leaking excessive amounts of oil, I'm not altogether convinced.
And despite the general disdain for them, 6 oil companies banded together in the 1990s to begin taking steps to address the oil issue, because nobody else was. They created the SWARS, Subsea Well Abandonment Rig Sharing Program, which oversaw and executed the proper plugging of 23 subsea wells off California's coast. This process was arduous, requiring the use of an Adriatic-class jackup rig that had to be brought to the United States from West Africa. It was expensive, but it needed to be done, and there is still much more to be done, and members of the oil industry are willing to do it.
Every time I see an involved in a large oil spill, I see a lot of consternation in the public and the press and a lot of blame for the oil company and the oil officials that were responsible for the pipeline or the tanker or whatever it was that failed. In large part, it's really a byproduct of running our economy on oil.
Human issues are environmental issues because we're a part of the environment. We have a direct effect on the entirety of the environment. So I think it is a very big issue for humanity and for the environment. Oh no, I really don't believe that.
I think we all live with the consequences of an oil-based economy. And if you don't come anywhere near a leaking oil well on Summerlin Beach, you are driving a car, you are using electricity in your homes. It behooves you to know where your power comes from and what the environmental impacts are to you and everybody else.
So I think you're right. Human issue, environmental issue, where do you draw the line? Is it fair to point fingers at the oil industry for the presence of oil, even as some of it originates from natural seepage? Is it fair to expect present-day oil companies or the taxpayers to foot the bill for the cleanup and proper abandonment of oil wells that neither are even responsible for? And is it fair to demonize the oil industry for extracting a natural resource that we all heavily rely upon? Who is really at fault? So tragic.